And joining me live now is former Home Affairs Secretary Mike Pezzullo, as he does every Friday. Mike, great to see you. It was great to read your contribution on Sky News Digital this week as well. From what we've just seen, the order of this bulletin, the contrast this week between China and this Chinese visit by Anthony Albanese and Talisman Sabre kicking off.
Good morning, Laura. Well, the contrast couldn't be any greater. On the Chinese visit, the six-day visit, and I listened carefully to what your colleague correspondent just had to say, and I agree largely with what she said. But with a slight difference, Laura, I think it was actually a very good trip, but in the wrong decade. This would have been an excellent trip in about 2005. It's almost as though Marty McFly has gotten into that DeLorean and went back in time 2 decades and now needs to get back to the future. We had a golden era in our relationship when China was less aggressive. From the time that Whitlam went up to China and did the iconic Great Wall walk, right through to about John Howard striding along the Bund in Shanghai, that was really the golden era of the bilateral relationship, when there was almost endless prosperity that you could envisage. And the Prime Minister's right. Engaging with China is about relationships. So a lot of that soft diplomacy that he was talking about is actually a perfect fit. In the wrong decade, we're about 20 years out of time. Because what happened about 20 years ago is that China started to change. We picked up on this in the Defence White Paper that Kevin Rudd did. You and I have talked about that before. And then these developments have really accelerated under President Xi, with this massive military build-up and the deadlines that your correspondent spoke about, which is to be ready to attack Taiwan in 2027, and if you allow for climactic conditions, that would probably be in the early part of 27, and then to have a dominant global military in about 2045. So the real action ought to be focused on deterring those adverse events, and if necessary, as the brigadier from the United States Air Force said, regrettably, if deterrence doesn't work, to be able to prevail in a fight. You couldn't have got a clearer contrast this week between the two different contradictory strands in our strategy at the moment.
So what should he have done? Should he have spent not as much time in China? Should he have gone there with a list of demands from Xi Jinping? Or do you do the diplomacy in front of the cameras on a nice visit like that, and you actually pull the levers that you need to behind the scenes?
Look, if I was advising him, I wouldn't have done the DeLorean time travel back in time. I wouldn't have done the 6 days with the pandas and all the rest of it, with iconic shots compared to Bob Hawke and the rest of it. I would have had a shorter, sharper visit. I would have certainly, the engagement with the President is important, President Xi. The leaders' dialogue with the Premier is also important. Behind closed doors, I would have had the hard discussion about Taiwan. I would have said, look, we support the status quo. We uphold the one China principle. However, war would be devastating for everyone, for you, for the Americans, for the Taiwanese, of course, and for ourselves, because we'd all get dragged into it. I'd have that blunt discussion. I would have had a day and a half, maybe 2 days in Beijing. And then I think he had 3 options. He could have gone to a combination of one or more of Seoul, Tokyo and Manila. That's one option. He could have gone to Washington. He's got a VIP jet. He could have gone across to Washington and had the same discussion with President Trump, because as you and I have talked about before, Laura, above tariffs and pharmaceuticals and all the rest of it, the key discussion that he's got to have with the President is about security in Asia. Or, frankly, he could have come down for the opening of Talisman Sabre and been the VIP guest and been briefed by both Australian and US military on the objects of that exercise.
Really interesting indeed. Well, let's talk about something that was prominent earlier in the week, and I thought really interesting. This leak by the Financial Times said, the Pentagon, the White House more specifically, is putting pressure on allies like Australia and Japan to say what we would do in the event of China going to war with Taiwan and the US intervening. Would we commit a Virginia-class submarine if we had it by then? Would we commit troops? Would we commit to the alliance? What does the ANZUS treaty say?
We've had since 1951 a commitment as military allies, Australia, New Zealand and the US originally. New Zealand dropped out in the 80s because of a difference with the Americans over nuclear weapons. So it's really a bilateral treaty. So under ANZUS, I'm not talking about AUKUS, but under ANZUS, since 1951, we're obligated to do the following: to work together to collaboratively develop our military. So Talisman Sabre is an example of that. To consult in the event of adverse security challenges confronting us both. That's Article 3. And then critically, Article 4 is to act together to meet the common danger should one or both parties be the subject of an armed attack. And interestingly, Laura, Article 4 is not just an armed attack on each of our territories, so the territory of the US or the territory of Australia, but also our islands. Islands are actually specifically named in the treaty, so that would include, for instance, Guam, but also our armed forces in what's defined as in what's called the Pacific area. The Pacific area has never really been delineated in the treaty. It was deliberately left in the 1950s as being ambiguous. But the Pacific area obviously extends from Alaska, which is US territory, right down to Australia and arguably everywhere in between. So if US forces, for instance, were engaged in combat in the event of an armed attack, potentially say around Japan, they've got forces in Japan, around Taiwan, in the Philippines, there's a very plausible argument to say that we're already committed as treaty allies to fighting alongside one another. I think the Financial Times story and the other media reporting has either misunderstood or misconstrued what I think the Americans are seeking, which is to start to do some of the planning and start to do some of the, if you like, the professional engagement around what that joint fight would look like, understanding that in every treaty, as you and I have talked about before in NATO, for instance, there is no carte blanche commitment because on the eve of a conflict or on the morning of a conflict, every nation makes its own political decision through its political leadership about what it's going to do about that particular conflict. But prior to that, the interoperability that you heard in that package, the joint plans coming together to think about, OK, if you've got, for instance, the 4 American Virginias down in Perth and we're getting Virginias, how would they fight together as a joint team? That is what I think this debate is really about, rather than some political commitment now set in stone that we would absolutely do certain things without regard to circumstances on the day.